The Marvels comic by Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross is considered one of the best stories of Marvel Comics, both for its art style in which each panel is an oil painting, as well as for its story. However, the comic has a very different approach than we usually associate with this company, as it presents us with a story where we are invited to see superheroes more as unattainable gods and less as human beings. This is somewhat unusual, as Marvel has historically been known for making their characters more relatable to us, giving them family, financial and social problems, and above all placing their stories in real cities like New York instead of fictional places like Gotham City or Metropolis. This realism that Marvel Comics injected into their stories is one of the main characteristics of the company, but the comic Marvels intends for us to momentarily put this aside and instead imagine a world where these Marvels exist, and what would it be like to watch their adventures in awe from afar. In this video then, I'm going to tell you parts of this story, and we're going to analyze what makes this comic so special. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and get ready because today we're going to take the Marvels comic very seriously. The first thing to keep in mind is that the Marvels comic begins in 1939, which represents the actual date when the Timely Company published Marvel Comics #1, where characters like the first Human Torch and Namor made their appearance. Eventually, the Timely Company would change its name to Marvel Comics in honor of this first publication. The central concept of this comic is to show us how the citizens of New York in the Marvel Universe reacted to classic stories like the arrival of Galactus, the appearance of the X-Men, and the death of Gwen Stacy. All of this through the eyes of its protagonist, a photographer named Phil Sheldon. The story begins with Phil and his reporter friends, among whom was a young Jay, Jonah Jameson, in a conversation that serves to give us context of what was happening in the United States at that time. In these panels, we see a group of young people extremely proud to be Americans, as the country had recently overcome an economic crisis and promoted the idea of the American dream, in which anyone could achieve their dreams if they worked hard for them. The comic presents us that Phil and all Americans of the time felt in a certain way invincible, as if they were Supermen. In fact, so much so that they were eager to enter World War II. However, all of this changed when the Wonders began to appear. Just like in real-life comics, the first Wonder to make its appearance was an android from Dr. Phineas Horton named Lantor Chumana, who had the power to combust upon contact with air. During his presentation, the reporters were skeptical about the android and mocked it by saying it was a mannequin with kerosene. However, when the android moved, the reporters' attitude changed radically, and they began to demand Horton to destroy his creation, as it was a danger to the world. The Human Torch had not committed any crime, it simply existed and moved, but we humans immediately reacted violently towards it, as if our survival instinct told us that this android would start a new era in the world in which humans are no longer the protagonists. And this is one of the central themes of the comic, our relationship with Wonders and how we humans perceive them, as the comic suggests that these beings make us feel obsolete. Even though Horton initially buried the torch so it would never see the light of day again, the android eventually escaped and many people saw it. However, shortly after seeing it face to face, they dismissed its appearance, thinking it was a collective hallucination and quickly forgetting it. The same thing happened when the second Wonder, Namor, made his appearance, where he faced the New York police. People thought it was a fraud or an elaborate joke, that is, how to conceive the idea that there were beings with such powers. Over the following weeks, the Human Torch and Namor began to save some lives, and people had to gradually accept that these beings existed, which led them to form an opinion about them which was usually not positive. And the fact is, even though Namor did save some people, he sometimes also confronted the police and was even sentenced to the electric chair, from which he escaped without problems. The fact that not even the government could contain Namor planted many doubts in Americans, and they began to suspect that perhaps they were no longer the protagonists of their own story. They were called Wonders, and that's what they were. Next to them, what were we? Before their arrival, we were so great, so magnificent. We were Americans, young, strong, vital. We were the ones who got things done, but we had become small. I saw it in those same faces, faces that were once so confident, so brazen. We stopped being players, we were spectators. We were waiting for something without really knowing what it was. The situation with these two wonders reaches its climax when the police entrust the Human Torch with capturing Namor. And this is another point that I love about the comic, the fact that it presents these great battles from afar and fragmented just as a person in this universe would see them, instead of seeing them up close as we readers usually do. Phil Sheldon and other reporters had the task of covering the biggest battle the city had ever seen, a battle that took place in the comics in Marvel Mystery No. 9 from 1940 and was called the Battle of Water versus Fire. According to Phil, the fact that these two titans were facing each other was like the gods of legends returning to Earth. And even though it was a huge battle, the reporters could barely keep up in their cars as both Namor and the Torch flew all over the city. This is another example of how the comic makes the differences between humans and wonders evident, as even the most experienced and dedicated reporters could barely understand why they were fighting and how they stopped doing so. The battle ended without a clear winner and without any consequences for the damage caused. And it seemed that people would simply have to get used to living with these two titans. But the arrival of a third Marvel changed all of this. His name was Captain America. And if you like taking comics very seriously and knowing their history, I have a course of 32 videos that are not on my channel, in which I talk about how superheroes went from being these patriotic characters like Captain America to the deconstructions we see in comics like Watchmen or series like The Boys. The course includes infographics, lists of the most important comics from each era, and quizzes to measure your knowledge. It also has a super special price right now. It shouldn't cost more than a comic book. If you're interested, I'll leave the link in the description for you to check out and my email for any questions. The arrival of Captain America completely changed people's perception of wonders. Every week the newspapers extensively discussed the feats of Captain Ibuki fighting the Nazis on the other side of the world. It seemed as if Captain America was indestructible. He dismantled Nazi guards like taking a walk in the park. He wasn't worried about bullets or bayonets. And the best part was that the captain was 100% American, which made the population see him as one of their own, a symbol they could trust. As the war progressed, other wonders like Namor and the Torch joined the fight against the Nazis, which made people also see them as part of the team. Unfortunately, just like in the comics, this didn't last long, as Namor and the Torch would face off again in New York City to the astonished gazes of the people who already saw Namor as an ally. Phil Sheldon again chased both of them all over the city with the intention of taking their photos and went beyond what his other colleagues reached. Phil pursued them to a rooftop where he saw the battle up close, just like we the readers see them. Unfortunately, the battle was so fierce that the debris injured Phil, causing him to lose an eye. And that's another one of the central themes of the comic, the fact that seeing the gods so close up is dangerous, that not all of us belong to that world, and we can't fly too close to the sun. Phil survived the accident and surprisingly did not blame the wonders for what happened. On the contrary, it seemed that now he was more interested in them. Not only him, but the whole city seemed to be amazed with this new generation of heroes, among which were the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. When the war ended, New York City began to get used to the daily appearances of wonders, despite still watching in awe as characters like Captain America, Thor, Iron Man or Giant Man saved the city and were considered heroes. The Fantastic Four, on the other hand, who did not have a secret identity, were public figures who enjoyed celebrity status. People were then very aware of Johnny Storm's romances, Sue and Reed Richards' relationship, and when they got married, the event was a media sensation, as if they were part of a non-existent royalty in the United States. The Wonders then seemed to enjoy general approval, all with the exception of a group of powerful individuals known as the X-Men. When mutants appeared to save someone, people immediately assumed that they were responsible for the tragedy and gathered to insult them and throw stones at them. It was as if an irrational fear took over human beings and forced them to act in the worst possible way. In fact, so much so that Phil at one point in the story runs into the mutants and throws a brick at Iceman, which left him wondering what it was about these characters that caused us so much fear. Why did we hate them so much? In a way, the mutants were worse than the supervillains. The eel was just a man in a suit. Dangerous, sure, but the torch would stop him. It was going to protect us. Who was going to protect us from the mutants? I couldn't help but wonder if the mutants were the price we paid for the wonders, the negatives without which the photographs we desired would not exist. What Phil felt, like the rest of the humans, was that the mutants meant our replacement as a species. It was as if their mere existence was a threat to our way of life, to our customs. Something that is absurd, but also something we have seen every time we feel an irrational hatred towards some minority. And the X-Men have always been a team whose stories are an analogy of all these human behaviors. Phil changed his mind when he found a little mutant living in his house, and this is when he started looking for information about them. Here we are told that even a person who has been very in touch with wonders can be infected by ignorance. Subsequently, people began to distrust superheroes more and more, whether they were mutants or not. Over the following years, we humans accused the Avengers of becoming corrupt, Daredevil of murder, and in general people began to suspect that perhaps the wonders were not the solution but part of the problem, that perhaps these superpowered beings caused more problems than benefits, and the public began to take a much more intolerant attitude towards them. In the midst of this, New York City faced a threat like no other. Galactus, the devourer of worlds, whose arrival on Earth was announced with a sky that seemed ablaze, and debris and clouds and a silver herald that seemed to symbolize the end of times. Humans then turned their gaze back to their marvels to save them, but seeing that the Fantastic Four were defeated, they lost all hope and there was panic and terror throughout the city. However, over the next few hours, New Yorkers were able to see how the Fantastic Four rose and finally ended the threat. Phil Sheldon at that moment thought that the Fantastic Four would be honored and there would be parades in their honor. However, what happened was very different. It turns out that the city felt somewhat embarrassed for having felt so much fear, and they took it out on the Fantastic Four, arguing that everything had been a big fraud orchestrated by Reed Richards, or they began to think that there really was never as much danger as was thought. As if by minimizing the threat, we could minimize the fear we had felt. Over the next few years, humanity began to distrust the wonders even more, as long as we didn't need them. It was like a cycle of hate and need that seemed to have no end. Between news of the Fantastic Four being kicked out of the Baxter Building and Black Widow being accused of murder, Phil Sheldon released his photo book where he presented the wonders as unreachable characters who save us even though we secretly resent them. The success of his book made Phil feel even more indebted to these characters. But above all, he was annoyed at how we humans behaved with them. That's when he took a more active role in the story and wanted to correct an injustice. Spider-Man was being publicly accused of the murder of former police captain George Stacy. However, Phil didn't believe this was possible, as he had seen Spider-Man be a hero on many occasions. That's why he interviewed some of the witnesses, including Dr. Octopus, to try to really find out what happened that night. His search for the truth finally led him to the former captain's daughter, a girl named Gwen Stacy, who also didn't believe that Spider-Man had killed her father. Phil interviewed Gwen on several occasions and gradually came to the conclusion that perhaps wonders don't need our approval, but exist to save innocent people like Gwen. But reality was about to hit hard, as Phil witnessed how Green Goblin kidnapped Gwen Stacy. When this happened, Phil followed the Goblin around the city and saw up close with the help of his telephoto how Spider-Man confronted him. The first time Phil was so close to the gods, he lost an eye, but tonight he was about to go blind. Then Spider-Man appeared, as he knew would happen, him or one of the others. He wasn't close enough to hear them, but he had his telephoto glasses. He could see everything. He should have called the police, but he had faith. He knew he would save her. It was what he did. It was what the Wonders did. They saved the innocents. That's why they were here. He had his finger on the shutter button, ready to capture the moment of triumph. And then the Goblin. He threw her from the... And Spider-Man? This is where the comic picks up Marvel's original focus, but makes us understand this in a very different way than any other comic. At that moment, Phil Sheldon realized that the Marvels were not perfect people. Seeing these characters so closely made him lose his sense of wonder. He could no longer see them the same way, and the same happens every time we read their stories, because we see them so closely that we are aware of every human error that the Marvels commit. This story represents a rethinking of what the Marvel Universe really is, and uses the incredible realism of Alex Ross to tell us that the Marvels look different from different angles, and that the perspective from which you see these characters matters. In a way, seeing the Marvels from the point of view of this comic suggests that it's like witnessing an amazing natural phenomenon in action, like seeing an aurora borealis, something that seems much more wonderful and magical when it's not explained. However, it also tells us that even though the Marvels in this universe are everyday occurrences, in a way they are so brilliant that we can't help but be amazed by them. And above all, we must be careful when looking at them head on, because the magic ends when we realize that the gods are made in our image and are as imperfect as we are. Kingdom Come, a comic by the same artist, takes a similar approach but with the DC universe. Check out my video about this comic here. That's all for today. I'm Go, the Geek Monitor. Keep looking beyond the obvious.